because I'll forget later if I don't start now. So welcome everyone. We're talking about rosé, everything rosé, the topic of the class. This is an intentional class, the same way that we seek out intentionally made rosés. So as we might wait for a few more people, maybe somebody just wants to share in the chat. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think rosé wine? Anybody go. So, and I'm asking this, what's that?
Oh, I always just think of the summer when I think of rosé. That's something light and fruity.
I love that. Summer, yes, light and fruity, nice weather. When I woke up this morning, I was like, oh, thank you, weather gods, for this perfect rosé weather day. Yes, I agree, Chelsea. Perfect weather, perfect company. Absolutely. And it's really important that you all kind of, are on this similar theme, because although I do believe that rosé wine can be drank all year round, and there is a wine for every occasion all year round, we really kind of look forward to the summer season and this kind of fresh, fruity expression of wine. We look forward to the people that we love to drink these wines with. And I kind of mentioned a few seconds ago, but we intentionally choose rosés we love to share with the people whose company we enjoy, right? And that kind of segues into what I think is sort of the philosophy of rosé that I want to approach today, is that rosé is an intentional beverage. It hasn't always been made this way, which we'll get into the history of that. But today it's made intentionally. The producers are selecting the site where they want to plant the grape. They're selecting the best grape varieties. It's no longer sort of a byproduct like it used to be. So I think understanding a little bit about how rosé wines are made, where they're coming from, and associating, again, those grape varieties, that climate with what we're tasting in the bottle and in the glass, can help us kind of always choose the best rosé, because there's a lot of different ways the wines are made. There's as many rosé styles as there are rosé producers, something I say a lot about other places, but it's definitely true. So I was kind of thinking about this class today, and it's sort of a funny memory to share, but anybody who's on the call who's ever worked in the restaurant industry, which I think is all of us or most of us that's ever been in the restaurant industry, you always have those moments where you like realize you forgot something, and it's always like 2 a.m. and you're laying in bed and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot a second martini on table 52, right? And it's just like you kind of forgot about it because you were busy or whatever. Well, one of those memories that always sticks with me about cork buzz was not quite like that, but there was very early on in my career at Cork Buzz, and this girl had come in and she said, I'll have a glass of rosé. And I was like, great, we have 10 by the glass. Like, what style are you looking for? And she goes, they all taste the same to me. I don't know any different. Just bring me the cheapest one. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I brought her the cheapest rosé. And I always thought after that moment, like, I really missed out on an opportunity to show somebody how different these rosés are from one another, right? I could have brought her easily at really very no cost, very minimal cost to Cork Buzz, a small, half an ounce sip of 3 or 4 different rosés, and I think that really would have opened her mind. And I've always looked back on that, or thought back on that moment of being like, oh gosh, I really missed this like learning with Amber moment, right? Early on in my career. So I think it's kind of funny that I'm going to try to rectify that today with you here. So beautiful day. I hope everybody's feeling good. And it's a fun topic. This class is lighthearted, right? We're talking about something we like and enjoy. As always, please feel free to share in the chat box any of these places that you've traveled to that we're going to discuss, your favorite rosé wines, what you like to eat with your rosé wines, right? Any of the places that you might be going, if you have a favorite, bed and breakfast or small hotel or winery to visit in Provence, we want to hear from you. Please share those things with your classmates. That's the fun of wine, right? Is the experience and the fun, which is one of the things we all sort of mentioned already. So let's see, I think everybody's on mute. So we're in good shape, guys. Fantastic. I have you for an hour. All right, so to talk a little bit about the history. Yes, there is history in rosé. So it's kind of interesting how over time it sort of became an unintentional byproduct of red wine production. But we know certainly that today that's not true. Rosé as a category is incredibly important. Many producers make rosé. We'll talk a lot about Provence, of course. One of the things that's so fascinating about Provence is it's the only region in France, and really, I think in the world, whose primary focus is rosé wine. So that's pretty exciting. So we think about rosé as going all the way back to Greek mythology, and fiction would mix red wine intentionally with water during his council meetings to cut back on drunkenness, to cut back on overly spirited conversation during this time. Sometimes they would drink just enough wine to invoke some spirited conversation, but you don't want to go over the top. So he would mix red wine with water, kind of creating a rosé wine. In ancient Greece, probably most of the wines that were enjoyed were of a rosé or an orange style. So we had shorter macerations. We didn't let the grapes spend a lot of time with the skins. They were probably pulled off and drank while they still had some residual sugar to them. We didn't have the same techniques for pressing the skins of the grape and macerating that juice with the skins. It's also likely that we often blended these white and these red grapes together, right? So we think about too, we had more oxidative styles of winemaking and wine production. We didn't have a bladder press or stainless steel barrel to keep these wines from oxidation, which can change the color. Now, the Greeks were the first to bring wine to southern France. They brought wine to Provence in 600 BC, and this is not only sort of the birthplace of, French rosé as we think of it, but also the birthplace of wine production in France. As far as we know, the Greeks were the first to bring the vine here. So that's pretty exciting. They pretty quickly focused on the rosé wine coming from this region, planting red grapes in this Mediterranean, sun-loving landscape. And it wasn't really until the Romans came that they brought the red winemaking technique to the area. So the Romans, as we talk about often, really took what they learned from the Greeks and expanded the technology for wine production, right? They drank so much wine. They were the first to really kind of focus on terroir specificity, understanding specific grape varieties grew better in certain climates and terroir. They built these restanques, or what we call these terraces. These are still present in Provence. Are they the exact same terraces? No, they're not, of course, but they kind of follow the original terraces that these Romans did build during this time, which is pretty amazing. They were also the first to use closures for glass bottles. They would actually flavor the wines themselves too by maybe lining the inside of an amphora or an oak barrel with a little bit of pitch to actually make fraudulent wine. You want to make something taste like Nebbiolo, just line the amphora with a little bit of pitch, and now you have a faux Nebbiolo tasting wine, right? So they even understood this, and they would doctor their wine to taste like they were coming from specific areas. So we really see red wine making begin to take hold in France, in Provence, but the area's rosés have always remained highly acclaimed. And so when we think about this, we can sort of see that Provence has actually been making rosé wine for going on 3,000 years. That's crazy. Rosé is not new, right? Rosé has been here forever and is here to stay. In the Middle Ages, although we see red wine production spring up around Europe, especially in France, we still see these sort of darker rosé styles quite prized. You might have heard of the term claret. We talk about a darker rosé in Bordeaux. It was very prized in the British market. They preferred the wine that were known as vin de nuit, which means the wine of one night. So essentially the juice would sit with the skins of the grape for just one night, gaining some color, some rosé color, but not too much color, like the vin vermeil, which spent longer on the skin, then were considered to be a little bit more kind of tough and tannic. I mean, you think about the Middle Ages, they didn't understand as much probably about the ripeness, no refractometers, right? We don't know about the ripeness of the pips, the ripeness of the stems, the ripeness of the skins of the grape for these red wine production. So it really all came down to taste, right? In Champagne, of course, we're beginning to understand the idea of pressing juice away from the skins of red grape to produce what we know of today as Blanc de Noir, or at the time it was kind of this sort of eye of the partridge, they called it, this sort of gray pink color, before Dom Perignon really understood how to very quickly separate the juice away from the skin. And that really created the Blanc de Noir category, right? The white from black rather than the Oeil de Perdrix, the eye of the partridge that we had prior to this time, kind of gray pink rosé. We're going to talk about rosé champagne a little bit more. Post World War II, two family wineries in Portugal, I think they were both coming from the area of Barata, really saw a opportunity to sell wine. They created both sparkling and still off-dry styles of rosé wine that just became incredibly popular on both the kind of the British, the European, and the American market. So these were sort of the first rosés that I think in the US people were really exposed to. These sort of, you know, fun, a little bit frivolous, not the highest quality. We have a little bit of sugar masking maybe what is, you know, poor grapes, not necessarily poor winemaking, but not the best quality grapes. But these styles of wine became incredibly popular. You will see questions about Mateus and Lancer in MS and MW exams because the influence they had was so incredibly important during this time. And then in 1975, Sutter Home released White Zinfandel. We're going to talk about Bob Trinchero and how this happened a little bit later on, but the 1975 release of this White Zinfandel exploded the blush and rosé category, especially for the US. Do we usually drink wines that are referred to as blush in the US? Not really, right? We think of these wines as being referred to as rosé. And I think a lot of us, when we see something called blush, we're like, oh no, like something in a box with a bag, a little bit sweet, not that good, a mix of red and white grapes, you know, you got like a little bit of red Zinfandel in there. You've got some ruby Cabernet, which is like a, you know, a crossing made to have high yield. You add a little bit of Gewürztraminer or Riesling to add some floral and fruity notes to it. You put it in a bag and you have your blush or your white Zin, right? But today, I think something that's really cool is there are a lot of producers that are in California in general, looking towards the kind of heritage winemaking and the historical winemaking of California. So we see quality producers releasing White Zinfandel today. And their White Zinfandel is going to be a rosé wine made from the Zinfandel grape. It probably is a dry style. I can't think of any that are making sort of an off dry style, but those are kind of some fun things to look for in California today. So rosé made everywhere. If you've got red grapes, you can make rosé, right? Where else? What else does it come from? Provence, we already know, the official, unofficial capital of rosé wine in the world. If you're in restaurants, guests ask for Provence rosé all the time. These are always a blend of these two grape varieties minimum. So primarily you see Grenache is the main grape. We actually have, as far as I know, the only exception to that today in the Côtes de Provence that we sent out from Cortez. But typically you have primarily Grenache, grows very well here. It's a thin skin grape, which helps it produce that really pale, kind of beautiful light rosé color that's very popular. Pinto, Syrah, Mourvedre, Carignan. These are all the same grapes you see in the Southern Rhone Valley, you see for Côtes, that you see for Chateauneuf-du-Pape, that you see for, what are some of the others? Right now, Gigondas and Baccarat, those are the ones. Now, it's near the Mediterranean coast, and we'll talk a lot about kind of pairing rosé wine made by oceans and lakes with similar food coming from ocean and lakes, right? And a lot of these Provence wines, we tend to talk about the garrigue, the Provençal herbs that cover the landscape, right? Herb de Provence, lavender, a little bit of thyme in there, right? Some sage. We'll talk about wine coming from other areas in France. So Loire, Burgundy, the Languedoc, Champagne. Spain, incredibly important. We call the Rosé Rosado here. Navarre and Cigales are the most important. And then Italy, of course. And I think Italy is really booming in rosé production. Historically, the production of all wine styles are very important in Italy. Sparkling, sweet wines, red, rosé, and white. And California, drinking a California rosé today, it's just fun, right? California wine is, such a fascinating category right now. So, as I mentioned before, not all rosé wines are equal, but maybe we should say not all rosé wines are made equally. There are higher quality production methods for making certain rosé wines. So there's the three main kinds we're going to talk about today. I'll throw in a couple of others. The first is Saunier. So this was your byproduct of rosé, of red wine, that really was kind of one of the main styles of producing rosé up until the last 20 or 30 years, when we're seeing, as I mentioned before, it's more intentional style. So Saunier was taking the red grapes, crushing them, and prior to the fermentation, bleeding off a little bit of that juice, or running off a little bit of that juice. Now that juice is pink, right? Because it hasn't had enough time to macerate with the skin, where you're gaining all of that color for red wine. So you would bleed off a little bit of this pink juice, and then the remaining red grapes with the juice would be concentrated. So you would have a higher proportion of skin to the remaining juice. You would have a red wine that was considered to be more tannic, more concentrated, maybe more complex. I don't think the complexity comes from that as much, but people might have thought this. And that rosé was a byproduct. This is also important because this rosé wine gave a lot of these wineries, especially in places like Provence, some cash flow, right? Red wine production is fairly expensive. It's more expensive than rosé production. It's more expensive than white production, usually, depending on where you are, because you typically have to have riper grapes. They're in the vineyard for longer. We usually ripen our red grapes longer than our white. There are exceptions, of course, like Riesling. And you're, leaving those grapes in the vineyard susceptible to the changes of weather during the harvest season. So typically red wine production is more expensive. Now, if we have rosé that we can sell, in February, March, April, you have some cash flow coming into your winery while you're aging your red wine. Now, skin contact or maceration, this is the most quality way of producing rosé wine. So we take the juice, it's white, and we leave it with the skins of the red grape. The white juice is not coming from white grapes. It's the juice of grapes is clear to begin with. I think you probably all know that, but just so we have a little bit of the backstory. And the juice from the red grapes sits with the skins for a short period. It gains some color, and then the juice is pressed away from the skins and then fermented. So in red wine production, the fermentation happens with the skins of the grape. That heat really draws out a lot of that color and that tannin. And when we're fermenting rosé wine, we're typically not fermenting the skins with the juice. We're just letting it sit with those skins for a little bit, taking some of that color, and then fermenting it on its own. We also see some regions that blend. So we mix red grapes and white grape together, and we produce a wine that way, right? So you might actually ferment your red and your white separately and then blend them before selling for a rosé wine. In most places in the EU, this is not how rosé wines are made. In France, there's only one area that can produce rosé wines in this method, which is Champagne. But we do see it more often used, particularly today, for some of those kind of like cool hipster winemakers and a lot of New World regions. So I'm seeing a lot of the blending, this mix of white and red grapes in places like, South Africa, Australia, and the US. So kind of cool. Another thing you might see is vin gris, which is direct press, or you might see direct press. Direct press is your really softest style or lightest style of rosé wine. So the direct press wines don't actually spend any time fermenting with the skins, or excuse me, macerating with the skins of the grape. And these will be your really like pale pink, your light salmon colored rosés, because all of the color that the juice gains is just from the pressing of the grapes itself. So direct press or vin gris. Vin gris is made from thin skin grapes, only direct press. So those are really your kind of really light pale rosés. You see this in places like Corbière from Grenache Gris, Grenache, Gamay, Pinot Noir. These are all styles of grapes that are thin skin that might be used for the vin gris style. Here you go. This is how we make rosé wine. So do we always destem the grapes? Not necessarily. Do we always crush the grapes? No, not if we're doing a direct press, but you can see how the individual styles of making rosé wine will lead to a difference in terms of the color of the juice, how intense that color is, and also the tannin and the texture of the juice as well. While we are gaining some color from the skins of red grape, we're also gaining everything else the skins of grapes have, right? Phenolics, some tannin to those, a little bit of texture in these wines. You can see this direct press, quite light. You can see in the maceration, we're spending a little bit of time with the skins of the grape, press that juice off, and fermenting a darker rosé. And then we might see the bleeding. So we're actually taking some of that rosé juice or some of that juice off of the red skins and then fermenting that. This is considered, Saignée is usually kind of the lower quality method of production. And the reason for that is not because of the Saignée production itself, but because it's a byproduct of red wine. We're not usually really intentional about how we're planting and growing our grapes for the rosé production, right? So when I talk about making an intentional style of rosé wine, producers are saying, where do I want to plant my grapes that they can retain enough acidity, but still ripen these red grapes well enough, right? Because it's really important when you pick your red grape for rosé production. If you pick too early, you have a lot of acidity, but you don't have enough time for the grape to develop a lot of complexity and flavor, right? If you pick too late, you have too low acidity for a rosé wine. That's not what we want. If you macerate too long, you have a little bit too much tannin and texture, kind of a bitter palate to the wine as well. So it's really important to be intentional about your rosé winemaking. So France is incredibly important. Although we talk about Provence as kind of the region for rosé wine, most of the wine that comes out of Provence is rosé, although they do make red and white as well. It's important to know. But every region makes rosé wine in France. And it's also important to understand that they produce 27% of the entire global rosé production. So that's really quite a bit for this one small country. Provence is producing 75% of all of the rosé coming from France itself as well. We're going to talk a little bit in a second about some of the smaller AOPs that you might see in Provence, which are important. So primarily Bandol. We'll talk about Côtes de Provence, which is we're drinking the Clos Cibonne coming from this area today, but we'll get to that. So we're down here in the south in Provence, the region of Champagne. Only about 2 to 5% of the wines from Champagne are actually rosé. So it's a pretty small percentage, but it's an important category. So this is the only region in France, as I mentioned before, that you can actually blend white and red grapes to produce a rosé wine. And I never want to confuse anybody too much, but there are places that allow in their rosé wine a little bit of white grapes, and Provence is one of those examples, but they're not resulting in a rosé wine because of that. So what I mean by that is, many of these appellations within their law is built in a little bit of a safety net for producers. So if you're growing grapes in Provence and you have a really hot year and you need to maintain acidity in your wine, you can add a little bit of white grapes in, right? Which might have a little bit more acidity. The resulting rosé color is not coming from the blend of those red and white grapes. That makes sense. See a little question. That's a great question, Jeff. I can't quite remember. I think that it is blended afterwards.
Okay.
But I can actually double check for you because I have that information in one of my books. So let me double check on that one for you because I can't remember and get back to you.
Okay.
So, and going back to Champagne, so we oftentimes blend white and red grapes here to produce a rosé style of wine. You can also just add a little bit of still red wine into your sparkling white champagne to gain a rosé color. So producers like Rorick do this quite often, where you might have a rosé wine that's 94% Chardonnay with a little bit of still red wine made from Pinot Noir or Pinot Meunier blended in. We also see the Saunier style coming from Champagne as well. And then importantly too, a separate AOP known as Rosé de Rosé. This is a still rosé wine coming from Champagne. It is an ageable style of rosé. So this is that style that you want to have with dinner. This is a holiday style of rosé wine. It is still fresh. It's coming from Champagne. There's a lot of acidity in Rosé de Rosé. It's 100% Pinot Noir, and it can only be made in the Saunier method, although it is an intentional style in this area. And the grapes come from the village of Rosé. I think it's further south in the Aube. It's a really fascinating style. You can get a lot of back vintage Rosé de Rosé, not talking about like 1960s, but I just tasted one the other day from 2012. It is quite rare. It can be an expensive style of rosé, but if you do run into it by the glass somewhere, maybe by the bottle in your price range, I think it's definitely something to try. Rosé de Rosé will be a more savory style of rosé. And you can just think about like having it with kind of all of the great food that, well, I mean, all of the food that comes from Champagne. The foods of Champagne are pretty humble, but the rosé goes well with those. Loire Valley. This is an incredibly important area for rosé, although they make so many different styles. You know about the reds from Cabernet Franc, from Pinot Noir, from Gamay. You know about the whites from, Malone, from Sauvignon Blanc, from Chenin Blanc in this region, even from Chasselas or Romorantin here, right? But it really is an area known, especially in France, for the production of its rosé wine. So I always worry that sometimes it can be confusing. So it's easy if you see a Chinon wine like Olga Raffel that's rosé, right? Chinon, we know the grape of Chinon is Cabernet Franc. The rosé here is also Cabernet Franc. If you see a rosé wine or a red wine coming from Sancerre, it can only be Pinot Noir, the only grape allowed by the appellation for red or rosé wine. Do you see them often? No, because production of rosé and red wine in Sancerre is only about 6%. 94% of the wines made there are white from Sauvignon Blanc. Now, where things get confusing is in Anjou, they make several different styles of still rosé wine. So you have Cabernet d'Anjou, that's made from a blend of primarily Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. This style is always noticeably sweet. We're not talking about, a really sweet style of wine like Port de Cham or Bonazou or Coteau du Lion, like a dessert style wine. But these are your noticeably sweet style of rosé wine. If you see Cabernet d'Anjou on the label, you might also see Rosé d'Anjou. These are your slightly off dry styles of wine, right? Like your drier side of Cabernet Riesling that you might get coming from the Mosel. So a little bit of perceptual sugar, but still really balanced. And then if you see Rosé de Loire on the label, these are your dry styles of rosé wine. So they have to have under 6 grams. I think Rosé d'Anjou is around 6 grams. Cabernet d'Anjou, if you're going to ask me about this, Jeff, I can also look this up because I have this information too, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But a higher level of residual sugar. So just keep that in mind. Cabernet d'Anjou sweet, Rosé d'Anjou off dry, Rosé de Loire, a dry style. These are usually from, besides the Cabernet d'Anjou, from blends of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Rollo, Gamay. You see, I think, a little bit of Malbec in Rosé de Loire, or Rosé d'Anjou, and a little bit of Pinot Noir. So it's a blend of these sort of traditional red grapes that you see throughout the Loire Valley. Burgundy, yes, Burgundy also makes rosé. The village of Marcenay in the north, in the Côtes is pretty well known for the production of its rosé wines. You can see Gamay rosé coming from Beaujolais in the south as well. Pavel, an AOP only for rosé wine coming from France. Now I said Provence is the most important, right? Well, it makes the largest production. Tavel doesn't actually make that much wine, although the only wine they're allowed to permit to produce is a rosé wine. You see these wines in the Languedoc, same thing as Tavel, same thing as Provence, based on the kind of traditional GSM blend, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre. And then also, like, let's do fun. Let's head out to a tropical island. Let's go to Corsica. You see, I love, you know, kind of looking at the idea of Corsica. The wine, just the grape growing take place along the perimeter on the island. You have Patrimonio up here in the north, and the grapes are really known for Grenache production for these rosé wines, primarily over here on the western coast. And then you see a blend of also these Italian grape varieties, right? Lucio, which is the same grape as Sangiovese, coming from Tuscany, Italy. Tuscany is right over here. You're heading just east, you'll run into Tuscany on the coast of Italy over here, and Sciacarello, which is the same as grape as Mamolo, which you also see as a blending grape within the area.
Garello.
Jeff, I'm putting you back on mute. All right, moving on. So let's talk about Bandol for a second. If anybody thought that Provence was just an easy, quick, pink, quaffable wine, maybe you're right, but also you're a little bit wrong too, because Provence is actually quite complex when you look at it in terms of the AOP production. It's split into several different AOPs. One of the most important of which for rosé production is Bandol. Bandol is important not just for rosé, but also for the quality of its red wine based on the Mourvedre grape. So Grenache tends to be more red fruited, kind of like lively and fresh and sun-kissed, right? Mourvedre is a little bit more Syrah-like, darker fruit, more complexity, kind of smoky and meaty, a little bit peppery. And it was really Lucien Perrault, coming from Domaine Tempier, that rescued the Bandol appellation from decline. So he married Lulu Tempier, and I think in the 1930s or 1940, and he was so instrumental in modernizing this region. He was working with the producers syndicate within the region of Bandol. He became later on part of the INAO, where he was on a committee who would taste the wines that were seeking the Bandol appellation on their label to make sure that they passed the quality and taste test of these particular styles of wines that they were producing. And Bandol really today is what it is because of him, and then these following two estates. So Domaine des Pipernon and Domaine Pradot, also quite important within this area. And the work that they were doing in like the 1940s, the 1950s, like they barely even had running water and electricity in this region at the time. So where they came in such a short period of time is really quite incredible. So the red wines have to be based on a minimum of 85% of the Mourvedre grape, but the rosés are about 50% or 50% at a minimum. So you oftentimes see a little bit of Grenache and Cinsault blended into these wines as well. You might see a little bit of Syrah here too, but these are really age-worthy, complex styles of rosé wine. If you go to your local wine shop, it's not uncommon to see these, especially Prado or Pivot. I think the Tempier is a little bit harder to get your hands on, but not by so much that you can't get it. We have it at Cork Buzz. But you might notice that these wines are oftentimes, the rosé category that's $30, $40, or $50, depending on which producer you're seeking out. But often you can also check out their red wines, which can be pretty incredible. So Bendel's here in the south. Most of the wine comes from the Côtes de Provence. So this red area, this here. So you're going to blend grape from anywhere, or you can, right? And make your wine Côtes de Provence. Les Baux de Provence is over here in the sort of northwest. This is really known for its organic and biodynamic producers, as well as the quality of both the red and rosé wine. But you can certainly see how this kind of has all these different enclaves of areas to produce wine. Red, white, and cassis. The teeny tiny area of Palette, making Chateau Simone, makes rosé wines in that area. So a lot of cool, fun stuff, right? Has anybody been to Provence? Like Lulu Tempier, she was really she just passed away within the last year or 2 years or something at 104 years old. But she also kind of created the Provençal lifestyle. Like she really did. The kind of idea of the good life, living in the sun, living off of the earth or eating fresh vegetables and locally raised meat and, food out of the ocean. And she was a wonderful cook. She was a consummate hostess. And she really made the region, helped make the region what it was, along with her husband. So the Tempier wines are really special to seek out. What are you going to drink when you're headed to Provence? Might get a little Chinon, Jean-Maurice Raffaux, coming from Loire, Cabernet Franc. Sancerre Rosé, 100% Pinot Noir. It can't be anything else. Tavel, half of the production comes from the local co-op. We usually see a minimum of 50% Grenache in these wines. Domaine des Fonsantes, you can see that this is from Corbière, the western side of the Languedoc, and you can see the very pale color. This is a vin gris style, which you can see on the label. It says Gris de Gris. So this is that direct press style with thin skin grapes. You barely get any color to this wine here. Clos, Cibonne, Tibouren, we're going to talk about this later on, one of our top favorite grapes at Cork Buzz. This is one of the only wines that is pretty much, there's been a few lapses, but it's pretty much been on the B by the glass wine list at Cork Buzz since we've been open. It's really important to us. And then we have Yves Lechia. This is a Grenache Rosé coming from Corsica, the western side. Talk about Rosado. Maybe you're going to Italy this summer. Everybody's vaccinated, right? Or hopefully we're getting there. Maybe we'll see some trips happening this year and next year, something to look forward to. You want to drink rosé wine when you're on vacation. We already associate it with summer and good conversation and great friends. We can also associate it with kind of that luxury, right? Like being on vacation, having a good time. Cereswolo d'Abruzzo is one of the appellations that we're seeing a DOC in Italy for very intentionally made rosé wine, coming from the area of Abruzzo. So you're familiar with Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, Montepulciano grape from the region of Abruzzo, which tends to be also kind of fresh and fruity, but also a little savory and meaty at the same time, right? It's a very easy drinking wine unless you're drinking something like Valentini or Emilio Pepe. Now, in 2013, they created a DOC specifically for its rosé wine known as Cereswolo d'Abruzzo. So Cereswolo means cherry red within Italy. These are coming from the Montepulciano grape as well. And they really produce this Chiaretto style wine. And when we say like Chiaretto, we usually talk about a deeply colored rosé wine with quite a bit of skin maceration, which is really what we see here in the region of Abruzzo. We'll look at some pictures of those wines in a second. In the Veneto, we're doing some pretty cool things. So if you're familiar with Bardolino, Bardolino is kind of like a baby Valpolicella, right? A little bit further to the west on Lake Garda. And we see the same blend of grapes. So Corvina, Rondinella, Molinara. And the Chiaretto di Bardolino is the DOC that's specifically being made from these grape varieties for rosé wine. They're great, they're inexpensive. Not a lot of people know about them yet. They're fresh, they're fruity, they're fun. And like seriously, they can be under $10 a bottle and they're delicious. And also like $10 a bottle, like $6, $7, like I'd take a risk on something like that, right? Be like, well, if it's the worst thing ever and I can't even drink it, I have to pour it down the sink. Like I'm okay to do that with a $6 bottle, but not a $26 bottle, right? Piedmont also does a lot of great rosé production from Nebbiolo. You see it coming from rosé production from the Pella Verga grape. You see it coming from Barbera. A lot of great producers that do make. You're in Piedmont. If you make Barolo, if you make Barbaresco, how long do you have to keep your wine before you can release it to call it Barolo or Barbaresco? 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, depending on the style that you're making, right? And whether you're coming from Barolo or Barbaresco. So what do you do when you paid for your entire harvest, all of your team members, the repairs for the oak barrels you need to make this wine, the repairs for your presses, for your fermentation vats and your tanks, the bottle that you're going to put your wine in? That's a lot of money to spend up front to hold on to that wine for 6 years, right? Or 5 years that you might have if you're making a Reserva Barolo. So it's important to have these wines that are releasable earlier on to engage some cash flow for the winery. In Sicily, Etna making great rosés from Nerello Mascalese. We see Nero d'Avola and Sorpato coming from other areas of Sicily as well. Puglia has a couple of its own DOCs, specifically for rosé production. Those, the grapes for those are primarily Negromaro, the very classic grape in Puglia, and Primitivo. So Primitivo, right? We don't call it white Zinfandel in Italy. We don't call Primitivo Zinfandel, but it is the same grape. And if we're making rosé from it, what is it? It's white Zinfandel. It's probably a little bit higher quality than the white Zinfandel we associate it with of 20 years ago, but kind of a funny idea there. In Lombardy as well, in Valtonese, you see Chiaretto again. So anytime you're really seeing this Chiaretto, you can assume that it's going to be this sort of rosé style wine. Also in Italy, I always like to say when we would do these classes in person, fun rosé classes, we should always talk about orange wines, right? And if we were doing an in-person class in Cortes, we'd be drinking 6 wines. And at the rosé class, my 6th wine was always an orange wine. Because I think it was important to consider the conversation, as I like to say, orange is to white grapes as rosé is to red grapes. So rosé wines are made from a short skin contact or maceration with red skins, right? And orange wines are made with a short skin contact or maceration with white grapes. So they also gain a little bit more color and some complexity from the skins of those grapes. Kind of fun stuff, right? So what are we going to be drinking? You can see these sort of darker Chiaretto styles of rosé. Is that the only style Italy makes? Of course it's not. But if you see the Chiaretto name, usually they're indicating a little bit of that deeper color. And then also you see a lot of the orange wines that are coming from the Northeast areas like Friuli, Grabner, and Radicon. They can be made in the sort of creverie or amphora that are buried in the earth as well. And just like rosé wine, the longer that these white grapes spend with the white skin, the more color that they'll gain. And just like red grapes, white grapes actually vary in the color of the skins and the thickness of the skin. And that will also affect the finished wine. Such fun stuff. So we're heading to Spain now. So we're talking about Rosado. So Rosé, Rosato, Rosado that we're talking about today. A couple of really important areas for the production of rosé wine, although unfortunately for some of them we don't see as much in the US. I really, really wish that we did. But you know, rosé is definitely a category that is also increasing within Spain, also growing in popularity. And a lot of it's drank or consumed locally within the area, especially coming from the area of Cigales, which we're going to talk about in a second. So Basque Country, if you've been to Cortes, if you've drank wine by the glass, you've had our friend on the left-hand side here. This is Amatoy. This is an example of a blended style of wine where we're blending Androuille Belza and Androuille Zuri, the white and red local grape of kind of the Basque region of Chocolate. Amatoy is one of our favorite producers. These wines are grown, it's not even on this map, unfortunately. So they're grown right on the coast up here in Basque Country, right on the border with France. And these wines are very, very close in proximity to the Atlantic Ocean. They are salty. They are meant to go with seafood. You think about the, you know, pulpo, the octopus, you think about the razor clams, you think about the barnacles that come from this particular area. You don't eat seafood. Maybe you want to have the padron, the little tiny shishito style peppers that they roast on the grill here can be really fantastic. And in the best way possible, these Amatoy wines almost taste like, have you ever had like salted watermelon juice, like really kind of like fresh and fruity red or rosé wine with this saltiness to it? They can be really fantastic. Navarra is the sort of one of the historical heartland for rosé production. In Navarra, the rosés can come from primarily either Tempranillo or Grenache, or Garnacha, as they like to call it within this area. These also tend to be your kind of deeper styles of rosé wine, although they're lightening a little bit. They're following the market trends in this area. You see a little bit of lightness in terms of the longer macerations and a lightness in color resulting from that. And Castilla y León, Cigales is an incredibly important area for rosé production, primarily based on the Tempranillo grape. I've never been able to have a Cigales wine. I wonder if anybody else has. They're just kind of located a little bit north of Rueda here. And they don't have so much in New York. They make a lot of the production. I can't remember the exact amount, but they make a lot of the production of rosado wine within Spain, but it's primarily drank within Spain itself. So drank domestically within the country. I tried to get some Cigales wine when we were doing the Spanish wine scholar at Cortes, and like literally, like I could not even get it in New York. There were a few brands and portfolios that had it, but I would have had to order like cases of it, or I couldn't meet a minimum, so we just weren't able to get it for that, which was really disappointing. But if somebody knows where to find a Cigales wine here in New York, please let me know. I want to get my hands on it. You're also seeing some fun styles coming from the Canary Islands. Another one of our favorite wines at Cortes is the Bodegas Bermejos, coming from the island of Lanzarote. This is 100% Listan Negro. It's made in a carbonic maceration style. So very similar to how they make Gamay coming from Beaujolais. This is the La Brunei coming from the Catalonia region here in the north. Terra Alta, known for Garnacha. You also see quite a bit of the Rosé Cava coming from Alea. This is the closest winery to Barcelona. So if you're heading to Barcelona for your first out of the country trip, you can go to Alta Alea. This is the winery, and the DO itself is Alea. So make sure you head to that area. All right, so talk about Germany. How are we doing on time? We've got 10 minutes. So I didn't say we were going to talk about Germany earlier, but we are, because there's a lot of cool stuff coming from this area. If you prefer more of the cool climate styles of rosé, you would enjoy wine or rosé wine coming from Germany. So you might look for Weiss Earth, made from a single variety, very popular within Baden. You primarily see this coming from Pinot Noir within this area. It's made in this Sanier style as well, coming down here from the south. So you can look for the Weiss Earth. You can also look for Schillerwein. So the Schillerwein is a ferment of red and white grapes together, co-ferment. This is common coming from the area of Württemberg. We're going just a little bit to the east of Baden, an area we don't see quite as much wine from. But then you also see other styles of rosé. These are actually terms that you'll see on the labels within the area, but you'll see other styles of rosé as well, coming from the Rheingau. We're going to talk about that in a second. Coming from R, you'll probably see these wines coming from the Pfalz or from maybe even from the Naha. So really important to look for these styles. And then in Austria, of course, also coming from the indigenous red grapes of the area, Rosalia DAC, known for rosé made from a blend of Zweigelt and Blaufränkisch, and West Steiermark as well, down in the kind of northwestern side of the country. You have styles of rosé labeled as Schulcher and Blauer Wildbacher. These also tend to be kind of fun blend of the region or made from local grape varieties as well. Leitz, one of our favorite producers, Leitz. If you ever see it, I always remind myself we pronounce it like lights out. So Leitz produces a really fantastic rosé of Pinot Noir. It's also inexpensive, but it is great. I mean, I think you can walk into like Union Square Wines and get these for like $15 a bottle. I also want to hear in the chat box, like, which rosé wine do you buy a case of every spring? I'm like really curious about that. I'm like, when it comes to springtime, you're like, I'm gonna, you know, take my $200 or $300 or $400 and buy 12 bottles of this wine so that I have a house rosé for the summer. Like, which wine is it? We really love the Grauburgunder. So this is a rosé wine coming from Pinot Gris, which can make a white or rosé depending on the level of skin maceration, since the skins of Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio are actually pink. So you get a little bit of rosé wine with a longer maceration. Grauburgunder coming from Enderle and Mol, located in Baden. This is a Müller Thurgau Bacchus Sylvaner orange wine blend, unfined and filtered. Moving over to Austria. This has always been a favorite of ours too. It's a Zweigelt rosé that is actually fermented on the skins of Gruner Veltliner. So it has a kind of like smoky, kind of ashy, peppery characteristic. It's a rosé that is not for the faint of heart. It really does have a lot of intensity to it because of that as well. And you can also see, of course, a little bit of Frisante. So here we have the Schulcher coming from West Steiermark. And I'm just trying with my German and my Austrian, so you can let me know how I'm doing. So the last thing we'll really talk about before we get into the wines we're talking about this evening, California. We talked a little bit about California at the beginning. I mentioned the name Bob Trinchero. So Bob Trinchero, one, ruined the name of rosé in California. Maybe that's a little bit too harsh, but he also saved a lot of these historic old vine Zinfandel vineyards. So we can actually thank Sutter Home and what they did with white Zinfandel. In 1975, Bob Trinchero was making a red wine, and his barrel suffered a stuck fermentation. So for whatever reason, the yeast stopped doing its job and eating the sugar and turning that sugar into alcohol. The fermentation stopped, and what he was left with was a barrel of wine that was rosé in color. When the fermentation stopped, it also stopped grabbing a lot of that color because there was not as much heat from fermentation. And there was also a little bit of natural grape sweetness left, or natural grape sugar left in the wine itself. So he tasted this wine. He's in the middle of the harvest, and he's like, I don't care about that barrel. I'll come back to it later. He comes back to it a few weeks later, and he's like, you know, this is kind of good. It's like kind of like off-dry rosé style of wine. It's 1975. Everybody in California and the U.S. drinks white wine. This is a problem for California because they're running out of vineyards that have white grapes in them. And he said, you know what, I'm gonna sell this. I'm gonna label this. I'm gonna sell this wine at this kind of off-dry rosé style. And it really, really blew up. It became very popular. I think in 1980 they were producing something like 25,000 cases of white Zinfandel, and 6 years later, in 1986, the production of the white Zinfandel was up to 6 million cases a year. Now, what this actually did, although not all white Zinfandel is made specifically from the Zinfandel grape, as I mentioned earlier, it's often a blend of red grapes in California, and then with white grapes blended in, especially the aromatic white grapes that you might see to add some floral notes, to add a little bit more acidity, for example, among other things. But it really did help turn the vast acreage of Zinfandel vines into something that white wine drinkers wanted to drink, which was this rosé wine. So it really at this time helped save a lot of these vineyards that would otherwise maybe have been converted to Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, and so forth. A couple of other producers that we love, Arnaud Roberts. We've got 2 cases at Cork Buzz. That's our entire allocation for the year. When it's gone, it's gone. This is a Touriga Nacional coming from the North Coast. So something really exciting about these California producers is, they're willing to experiment and find out which of these sites are growing red grapes that make phenomenal rosé wine. Steve Mathiasen, he's a stickler for his way of winemaking. He says, I would never want to produce a rosé wine that was high in alcohol. In his mind, these rosé wines should be mineral, they should be fresh, they should be crisp, they should be low in alcohol to have on the table and enjoy. Angela Osborne making rosé wine coming from Grenache. This is the grape that she really, as far as I know, she only works with. I don't think she does anything else. Angela Osborne grew up in New Zealand, but loved the Grenache wine, Grenache grape so much. She searched the world for the perfect place to grow Grenache and make wine from it, and landed in Santa Barbara. So you can check out her rosé wines, and also her Grenache reds are fantastic. We're going to talk about this in 1 second. And then, of course, can't talk about every wine. So, Martha Stoneman, Stolpman, Root Down, these are all great examples of producers who are making intentional styles of rosé. They may not have planted these vineyards intentionally for rosé, but they've really come to notice that these sites are really special for maintaining great acidity, but still ripening the grapes enough that we get, as I mentioned before, that complexity and that flavor that we want in rosé wine, right? We don't want it all to taste like kind of nothing. And then we'll talk about, I'll include this. This is just a quick idea of, how we pair rosé wine, but we pair rosé wine the same way we pair every wine. Have it with what's good. No, I don't mean that. What I really mean by that is, of course, you look at the acidity in the wine, you look at the price of the wine versus the cost of the food. If you're drinking kind of a, light rosé for $15 a bottle, you probably want to have that with, like a good hot dog in the backyard with sauerkraut, right? So you want to think about matching the intensity of the flavors in the wine to the intensity of the flavors in the food. You want the fresh acidity that you have in rosé to really match with a lot of foods and so forth. If you have fish tacos with pineapple salsa, you might want a rosé that has a little bit of sweetness to it, right? To match the sweetness of that fruit. So, Clos Cibonne. I love this wine. We've had this on our By the Glass list pretty much for the entire tenure of Cork Buzz and every one of our locations. This is a property that dates back to the late 1700s. They're incredibly important because they make the wine from a grape called Tibouren. So Tibouren is an ancient indigenous grape variety to Provence. You might have heard of it. It's also known as Rosé in Italy. It comes from Provence. Somebody liked it. An Italian came over. He said, this is delicious. Took it to Liguria, planted it there. You find it in areas like Rosé, Dolce Acqua in that area as well. And this is the only winery, as far as I know, in France altogether that can list a grape variety on its label that is not the grape variety that is actually sanctioned by the AOC. So the Côtes de Provence requires that you actually use 2 grape varieties, the majority of that, which is typically Grenache. I think you can also use Cinsault, you see some other things, but 2 grape variety, Grenache, Cinsault, Mourvedre, the main, the GSM, right? Syrah, the GSM blend that we see within this area. But they were able to prove that they've been growing Tibouren and making a style of wine in this way for so long that they received special permission from the INAO to actually make their wines using Tibouren. They list the grape on the label, and And they also say that it's still like Côtes de Provence wine. So this is a really great exception. And the wines are absolutely phenomenal. These are also ageable rosé styles of wine. They're incredibly close to the coast. And if you're enjoying this wine right now, so I made notes earlier, I tasted these wines at work, and I was like, first off, I haven't tasted the 2019 vintage, and I was like, this is banging. It is so good. It's absolutely delicious. And I just kept writing because there's so much complexity to this wine. It is aged for 12 months under a veil of flor. So kind of similar to how you would make sherry. You might notice that you get a little kind of like briny olive or, kind of chamomile character here that you might get in sherry. It's a very thin veil. It is open to oxygen. It's not like in sherry where the veil is completely protecting it from oxygen itself. It's much thinner here, but you get a little bit of that characteristic to it. The foudre are incredibly old in this case. And when I tasted it earlier, I was like, it's salty, it has tart fruit. It reminds me of drinking a Bellini that's kind of like really, really fresh peach, right? If you have a Bellini with peach juice that's just been squeezed right there. But it also has this kind of savory character. I mentioned that manzanilla, a little bit of that kind of briny green olive, some white pepper. And it's kind of like textured, right? Almost like yellow plums. What do you call those? I think they're marabelles, or some like a little bit of mandarin skin, this like slight waxiness to it. And I'm like, gosh, what are you guys gonna have for dinner with this? Like, are we having I'm glad to, oh good, I've got some good comments here. So what are you gonna have? I mean, all kinds of mezze, right? Peppers and olives and crudité, octopus, sardines, cheeses would be really fantastic. You go to Provence and you just want to put together a crudité plate to eat. All of that would be absolutely incredible. One of the most common things to serve with this wine is actually is octopus coming from the region. So Scott, you just mentioned these wines are so incredibly different. And I'm happy you said that, because that's really what I want from these wines. The way that we produce these rosés, as I mentioned, is very intentional, and they should be very different styles. And they're both delicious in my mind, but completely different wines. Like, other than the fact that they both fall into the rosé category because they're made from red grape, but they're not red wines, I don't think you can make any other comparison about these two. So this is the Queen of the Sierra Zinfandel blend. It's coming from a single vineyard called Rorick Heritage Vineyard. So Matthew Rorick started Forlorn Hope in 2005. He's had an interesting life. He used to ride skateboards for a living. He worked for the US Navy. He built electric guitars for a living. And he purchased the Rorick Heritage Vineyard in 2013. It's organically farmed, located in Calaveras. And it's really inspired by California's kind of pre-prohibition viticultural tradition. And a lot of producers in California purchased grapes from this vineyard. So not only does he make his own wine from his vineyard, but you have producers like Morgan Twain Peterson. He's a master of wine. He makes the wine for his project Bedrock. You recognize the Peterson name? Yes, he's the son of Joel Peterson of Ravenswood. I mean, the way that the nepotism and the way that producers are connected in California is really fascinating. Joel Peterson worked for Joe Swan, made Zinfandel, on and on and on. He prefers to make these wines organic. He's very hands-off. The wines are unfined, they're unfiltered, they're fermented with native yeast. And he really loves these styles of wine. And he makes a lot of different wines. Like, this is a guy who makes like Grenache, and he makes literally everything. I can't believe I'm blanking, but he makes Zinfandel, he makes Grenache, he makes Cabernet, he makes a blend of Tempranillo and Graciano, just like you might see in somewhere like Rioja. And this particular rosé this year, the blend of Zinfandel, Grenache, and Tempranillo itself. You can see that it's unfined and unfiltered. It's a little bit hazy in the bottle, but not too hazy that it would really kind of like turn you off of drinking the wine. And for me, I love this wine because it has a lot of sun-kissed, almost candied fruit to it, right? Like, I'd love to hear what you guys think, but I would like, this one's like watermelon Jolly Ranchers, kind of like peach ring candy, but without the sourness, right? And this wine is not sweet. There's no sugar to it when you drink it on the palate, but it has this intensity of very, very sun-kissed and ripe fruit to it, which I just like really, really love. But it's also a little bit savory. There's kind of like this like umami character that's a little bit more sesame-ish in style, like sesame stick, right? That I really enjoyed, kind of like, you know, cantaloupe and like slight almond characteristic to this particular wine. What are you gonna have this with? I would like, well, like a watermelon salad with feta, right? Like juicy, fresh watermelon with like kind of like salty feta. You might add some you know, green olives in there. Some cucumber would be really nice. You could have this with a caprese salad. It has enough fresh acidity. This is a really high elevation site in California. It has a lot of fresh acidity that you can pair it with anything with tomatoes. I mean, paella, jambalaya. I want to have a BLT with this, right? Tomato, fresh lettuce, it's coming into season, really good bread, herb mayonnaise, and like the best tomatoes and really like yummy crispy bacon, right? Like, how good does that sound to have with this wine? I really think that they would go fantastic together, but it doesn't end here. This is really a wine, both of these, that you could pair with so much. You can pair especially the Clos Cibonne mushroom dishes, anything that has a little bit more savoriness to it, especially as it gets older too, I think would be really fantastic. Rosé wine. All right, let me check in on some of your questions. Sorry, I would like, you know, trying to get through all the fun of rosé. What are we thinking, everybody? So, Lindsay, you're talking about the Triennes. Yes, Domaine Dujac and DRC. That's you know, why do we learn about wine? Because you can find better value. Triennes is the project of Aubert de Villaine from Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, and Jacques Cess, or Jeremy Cess, maybe rather, of Domaine Dujac, two of the most expensive producers in Burgundy. You can buy their rosé for under $20 a bottle. How crazy is that? It's amazing. Messiaen, yes, absolutely love. I think the Messiaen rosé is usually based on Grenache. And oh, cool, Jeff. Thanks for the tip. I'm gonna check that out when I come back out. So he's saying that there's a small chain in San Francisco called Spanish Table that might have Cigales. If anybody's out there, you want to try that rosé coming from Tempranillo. And yeah, let's have some crab and everything. You guys are great. Are you enjoying your rosés? Good. These are really two of our favorite styles. As I mentioned before, we always want to try to send you wines that we really love. They might also be smaller production. And the Forlorn Hope, the Queen of the Sierra line that you have here, this is really his wine that he makes primarily for restaurants and like small retail shops. So you might not be able to find this particular wine as easily, but you might find it if you have the right place in your neighborhood. But as always, you need wine for the rosé season, just let me know. We've got you covered. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great night. Enjoy your wines. Enjoy the gorgeous weather. Sit outside on a patio or a yard if you have one. All right, I'll see you soon.